Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really unpacking a topic that gets people thinking, veganism.
Hmm.
You shared some really interesting material, and it seems to go way beyond just, food choices. It frames veganism more as a core ethical stance on animals.
That's right. Yeah, the sources really hammer home that veganism is fundamentally rooted in animal ethics.
Okay.
The central idea, really, is that animals are sentient beings. They deserve respect, they deserve freedom, and they shouldn't just be seen as, well, resources for us.
Right, not just commodities. So our mission today is to explore that with you, get past the sort of surface level, it's a diet idea, and understand these foundational principles.
Exactly.
Have you ever stopped to think about the real why behind veganism? We're going to dig into the main arguments from your sources, and I think.
Well, I think we might uncover some perspectives that challenge how we usually view animals and what considering their well-being actually means.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's get into it. The sources really seem to build everything on one core concept, sentience. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's striking is how the sources point to the growing scientific consensus here.
Uh-huh.
It's not just, dogs and cats or primates. They talk about a whole range of animals, mammals, birds, fish, even some vertebrates experiencing emotions.
What kind of emotions are we talking about?
Well, the basics, like pain and fear, obviously, but also joy, apparently,
Mm.
forming social bonds, even things that look like grief. These feelings aren't uniquely human.
It really makes you pause, doesn't it? Thinking of them not as just biological machines, I suppose.
Exactly.
And your sources stress that this capacity to feel, to experience the world, that's what gives them moral weight. It's not about, say, how intelligent they are in human terms.
Precisely. It's about their capacity to suffer, their drive to live. That's the core of it.
So what are the implications then, if we accept this widespread sentience?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we understand they feel fear, they feel pain,
Mhm.
much like we do,
Mhm.
it sort of changes the moral calculation. It makes us ask, does our convenience or our taste or tradition outweigh their fundamental right to avoid suffering? It pushes for ethical consistency.
And the sources connect this to a bigger idea, right? Something about inherent rights. They use the phrase subjects of a life.
Yes, subjects of a life. Can I elaborate on that a bit?
Please do.
Think of it like this. A subject of a life is a being with its own experiences, its own desires, its own welfare that matters to them, regardless of whether they're useful to us.
Ah, okay, so it shifts the focus. We're not granting them rights.
Exactly. We're recognizing rights they inherently possess just by being alive and feeling.
Yeah.
It's about their intrinsic value.
Got it. Now, most people think veganism equals diet, but the sources are clear it's much broader.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point in the material, opposing all forms of animal exploitation.
So food meat, dairy, eggs, honey, that's a big part, obviously.
A very visible part, yes.
But it also means rejecting animals used for clothing, like leather, wool.
Right. And for entertainment, things like traditional zoos, circuses, and animal testing, especially for cosmetics, it's really meant to be a comprehensive stance against commodifying animals.
Which brings up that tricky concept you sometimes hear about, humane exploitation. How do the sources tackle that?
Yeah, they really challenge that idea head on. They ask us to look at the fundamental problem of treating animals as property, regardless of the conditions.
So even things like free range.
Exactly. Take dairy, for instance.
Mhm.
Even on farms that might seem nicer, the cows still face repeated forced pregnancies.
Right.
And their calves are almost always taken away soon after birth. That causes distress for both mother and calf,
Yeah.
or egg-laying hens. Okay, maybe they have more space, but they're still often killed when their egg production drops.
So from the vegan perspective presented here, even if conditions seem better,
It doesn't change the core issue. They're still being denied autonomy, still treated as a means to our end. It's the commodification itself that's the problem. What strikes you about that particular challenge?
I think it forces you to look past the surface treatment, to the underlying idea of ownership and use. It's not just minimizing suffering. It's about the right not to be used at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that links directly to another key point in your sources, this idea of inherent worth versus just usefulness to us.
Yes. And what's fascinating is how it pushes back against such a deeply ingrained way we think about animals.
Oh, so?
Well, society often values animals based on what they do for us, right?
Yeah.
Food, labor, companionship even, but sometimes in a sort of transactional way.
Sure.
The vegan philosophy, as laid out here, flips that entirely. It says animals exist for their own reasons, independent of us. Their lives have value just because they are living them.
Intrinsic value, existing for their own sake,
Yeah.
not for what we can get from them.
Precisely.
And the sources connect this strongly to bodily autonomy.
They do. Just like we believe humans have a right to control their own bodies, to not have things done to them without consent. This ethic extends that principle. Things like forced impregnation, which we mentioned, or painful mutilations like debeaking chickens or docking pig's tails.
Which are common farm practices.
Very common. And ultimately slaughter itself. These are all seen as fundamental violations of their bodily autonomy. Their bodies are theirs. That's the argument.
That really elevates it beyond just a diet choice, doesn't it?
It really does.
And the sources actually frame it as more than just a personal choice. They talk about it as a moral imperative, even a social justice issue. How do they make that link?
That's a really critical point they make. It's not just about being kind to individual animals. It's framed as a matter of justice.
Justice. How?
Well, they draw these powerful, maybe provocative parallels between how animals are exploited systemically and other forms of oppression against human groups.
Okay.
Looking at the mechanisms of power, control, creating hierarchies to justify using others. The sources suggest these patterns are often disturbingly similar. There's even that quote included from AFCO, "Animal rights is a social justice issue."
Wow. What resonates with you about comparing those things?
For me, it's the call for ethical consistency. The sources raise that point. Most people agree hurting a pet, a dog or cat, unnecessarily is wrong, deeply wrong.
Of course.
So the question becomes, why is it acceptable to inflict similar, or often far worse, suffering on a pig or a cow or a chicken? Where do we draw that line, and is the justification truly sound?
Is it just species?
Exactly. Is species itself a morally relevant reason to deny consideration? If it's really about sentience, about the ability to suffer, then the argument is that the species shouldn't matter.
Which leads into another area the sources cover, respecting animal agency and intelligence.
Yes, that's a natural progression. What examples that stood out to you from the reading?
Well, the description of bees doing their waggle dance to communicate complex directions, that's amazing.
Isn't it?
Or elephants showing what looks like profound grief. And pigs playing video games. Seriously.
Apparently so.
Yeah,
It definitely challenges stereotypes.
it really does. And the sources argue that dismissing this intelligence, sort of downplaying it, has historically propped up this myth of human superiority.
Which, in turn, makes it easier to justify exploitation. If we think they're dumb animals, it feels less ethically problematic to use them.
Right. So recognizing their intelligence and agency strengthens the case for, what, coexistence?
Coexistence rather than domination, yes.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest concrete actions that follow from that. Things like protecting habitats, which is crucial.
And fundamentally changing how we produce food.
Absolutely. Dismantling factory farming is presented as a logical outcome of this ethical stance.
Okay. Now, there's a question that always seems to come up in these discussions. Your sources tackle it directly. But what about plants? Don't plants feel pain?
Ah, yes, the plant question. It does come up a lot.
But
What do the sources say on the science?
well, they draw a pretty clear line based on biology. Plants are alive, they react to things, obviously. But the scientific understanding is they lack the necessary equipment for pain as animals experience it. No complex nervous systems, no brains, no pain receptors like animals have that signal suffering to a conscious mind.
So biologically, that capacity for sentience we talked about earlier, that's the key difference.
That's the argument presented, yes. And they also make another really interesting practical point.
Oh.
Even if you did think plants felt pain in some way, a vegan diet actually uses fewer plants overall
How does that work?
because so many crops, vast amounts of corn and soy, are grown just to feed livestock.
The intermediary.
Exactly. So eating plants directly rather than feeding them to animals and then eating the animals means less total plant cultivation. It kind of flips that argument around.
That is quite counterintuitive for many people, I think.
Definitely. So as we kind of bring these threads together, the sources really frame veganism ultimately as whatever, a kind of radical act of respect.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
A fundamental rejection of that old idea that animals are just here for us, for whatever we want. It's presented as this conscious, ongoing choice to see them as individuals. Individuals with their own value, their own lives, and a right to be free from human exploitation in all its forms.
Yeah, there's that really powerful Alice Walker quote included in the material, isn't there? Comparing animal subjugation to the oppression of marginalized human groups.
Yes, it's incredibly potent. It really highlights that idea of ethical consistency again, that denying freedom and respect based on arbitrary differences, whether it's species or race or gender, is fundamentally unjust from this perspective.
It drives the point home.
It does. And I also like the concluding thought mentioned, something like, respecting animals isn't about perfection.
It's about aligning our actions with the conviction that their freedom matters. Yeah, I noted that too.
It acknowledges it's not always easy living in a world not set up for this, but it's the intention, the consistent effort to minimize harm that counts.
So, synthesizing everything from the sources you shared, it seems clear veganism at its core is positioned as this really profound ethical commitment. It's about animal liberation, grounded in recognizing they're sentient, that they have an inherent right to freedom. It really challenges us, I think, to fundamentally reconsider our entire relationship with the animal kingdom.
Absolutely.
Oh.
It demands a shift away from just seeing the world through human needs and wants, towards acknowledging the worth and the autonomy of all sentient beings.
So, thinking about all these arguments laid out in the sources, what's one aspect of how we currently interact with animals that you think might be the most impactful for people to reevaluate, ethically speaking? Definitely food for thought.
It certainly is a lot to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.